So what I wanted to ask you, Emily, is the government on track to reach net zero carbon emissions by 2050?
Well, that's the thing. It's like the Committee on Climate Change is the government's own internal advisors, right? So these were appointed by the government, this committee. And last year, the report was incredibly damning. The government was accused of acting like a dad's army type approach to combating climate change. So we were really hoping, although obviously we didn't have much high expectations, that there would be at least some improvement this year. But it's absolutely staggering, the lack, not just of meeting their own targets, but also lack of preparation of how they're preparing the UK for what's coming. So the government set really minimal targets, far, far lower than they should have been in order to try to get to carbon zero by 2050. They weren't being nearly ambitious enough in the first place. And there's been a failure to meet even those own targets. So, for example, of the 21 key indicators that were supposed to show progress towards meeting the carbon budgets to get to net zero by 2050, only 4 of those are on track. That's 4 out of 21. And out of the 31 milestones for actions that the Committee on Climate Change recommended, well, said the government needed to take in order to get to carbon zero by 2050, only 2 of those out of 31 have been achieved. And there's been partial progress on 15, which leaves 14 with presumably no progress at all. The report has also shown that the current carbon budgets that have been set, which is basically the amount of carbon we're allowed to burn as a country to try and get us to closer to carbon zero each year. We've already blown through several of those. The Committee of Climate Change are saying that we need much steeper reductions in emissions than are even being catered for by the targets that are being set by the government. And anyway, those targets aren't being met. So not only are the targets wrong, they're not being met, the actions are not being met it's enormously across the board. And the government is absolutely not preparing us for what's coming. So we're currently, if we don't put strong, radical and bold changes in place right now, we're on target, we're on course, we're not on target, we're on course to hit 1.5 degrees warming at around 2030. Now, 1.5 degrees warming is what the IPCC has said to us. Well, they can't advise, but we know, the scientists know that this has a huge risk of catastrophic and irreversible impacts on our planet if we go above 1.5 degrees.
And why is that? People don't understand why, like 1.5 degrees warmer than pre-industrial levels, why is that catastrophic to our planet? Can you sort of put it in the basic terms for us?
Of course. So we are currently hotter than we have been any time in the last 2,000 years. Our rate of heating right now is hotter than any time in at least the last 10,000 years in terms of how hot we're getting, how quickly. And that's due to carbon dioxide in our atmosphere. Our carbon dioxide levels in our atmosphere are currently the highest than they've been in 3 million years. And they are rising 100 times faster than they have for at least any time in the last 800,000 years. So any time carbon dioxide have changed and levels have changed naturally, we're now changing 100 times faster than that. And this is 100% certain that this is due to human action. This is due to the release of carbon dioxide from burning fossil fuels, from deforestation, from ploughing soils that hold carbon, also from methane, from cattle farts, and from paddy fields, and also nitrous oxide from fertilizers used in agriculture and from animal waste. So all these fossil greenhouse gases are going into the atmosphere. They're causing heating of the atmosphere. Now, we're currently 1.1 degrees hotter than we were at the start of the Industrial Revolution when this really ramped up. Now, 1.1 degrees might not sound like much, but that's the equivalent to 5 atomic bombs worth of energy going off in our atmosphere every single second. That amounts, when you spread it over the whole planet, to 1.1 degrees. But if you think about how much energy that actually is, all of that heat gets trapped in our Earth system. And that heat is causing rises in global temperatures. On average, some areas are a little bit colder, but most areas are a lot hotter, and they're getting a lot hotter, a lot faster. The poles are actually warming twice as fast as the global average. So what that's meaning is that we're getting heat waves, we're getting more and more extremes of heat temperatures, more frequent and more extreme. We're also getting more rainfall in areas where it's usually wet. It's getting much, much wetter because the heat makes more evaporation from the ocean. We get more water vapor in the atmosphere, we get more clouds. And when the clouds fall, the rain is more frequent and it's heavier. So we get floods, we get thunderstorms, we get strong winds, we get hurricanes, we get typhoons, we get monsoons in tropical areas, we get enormous downpours. And that's what we're seeing across the world. We're seeing huge extreme weather sort of violations. Extreme weather events are twice as frequent today as they were since the 1990s, and 2/3 of those have been made. 2/3 of extreme weather events have been made more frequent and more intense due to climate change, and this is already happening at 1.1
And
degrees.
this is killing people now,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
It's not just like a bit of rainfall or
exactly.
a few climate. Yeah.
Exactly. This is killing people across the globe right now, particularly in the global south, particularly in areas that are poorer, but it's hitting here as well. If you look at the floods that there have been in the UK, we're also looking at sea level rise because the heat is melting the ice caps. That if you melt land sheets of ice and glaciers, which is happening, it gets dumped into the sea. Plus the heat causes the water in the ocean to expand and take up more space, which means sea levels are rising. So we are currently at 1.1 degrees, and this is already happening, but we are heading to 1.5 degrees, and it's going to get a lot worse. We're heading there by 2030. That's in the next 10 years. And by 2040, at the current rates of emissions and at the current rates of warming, we're looking to get to 2 degrees by 2050. Now, 2 degrees, we all signed the Paris Agreement. 175 nations signed, I believe, signed the Paris Agreement to say that we must not go above 2 degrees. I mean, that was internationally recognised, and we must absolutely try our absolute best to stay below 1.5 degrees. At the moment, we're heading for 1.5 in 10 years, and we're heading for 2 by 2050. By the end of the century, we're heading for 3 or even 4 degrees, and scientists across the globe are terrified, saying that this is unthinkable. Huge parts of the world will become uninhabitable. We're talking about sea level rise that will cause hundreds of millions of people to have to leave their homes because they'll be flooded all the time or regularly. We're talking about mass migration. We're talking about health issues of intense heat. We're talking about areas where people can't live, where creatures can't live, and we're already facing the extinction of 1 million species due to human action in the next few decades as well. So it's not just the climate, it's also what we're doing to our species, what we're doing to our land, what we're doing through intensive agriculture. And this is going to get a lot worse. We're already seeing it here in the UK. We're seeing flooding, we're seeing heat waves. Some of us might think, oh yeah, it's nice and warm. But by 2050, we're looking at an extra 7,000 deaths every year in the UK due to excess heat. And we're looking at thousands of millions of deaths across the globe. By 2050, we're also looking at food shortages because heat here translates to crop failures across other sides of the globe. We're an internationally connected society. If crops fail in other parts of the globe, then that has a knock-on effect on harvests over here. And that it's, the head of the World Bank has said there are going to be battles for food. So we're looking at a level of heating already in the next 10, 15, 20 years, which is going to be catastrophic and have massive impacts on every single person in this country. So there are areas around the Thames, areas on the coastal plains that are going to be by 2050 that are going to be seeing floods, regular floods. People are going to have to relocate. We're talking about shortages of drinking water. London is already pushing close to its capacity in terms of getting fresh water from its rivers, and that's going to get worse and worse with flooding and with heat waves. So we're talking about serious water shortages, even here in the UK, even in London, in the capital, by 2040, let alone 2050. And by 2050, in terms of food, because of potential crop failures, crops are already getting less nutritious, that crops are already going down in their yields, as well as getting less nutritious because of climate change and because of changes to land use and intensive farming. And we're talking by 2050, it's predicted that there will be 5 billion people across the globe who are subjected to food and water shortages. That's an extra 1.5 billion more than we have already today. And that's going to be particularly in areas such as like Africa and Asia, which are already in poverty, a lot of those areas. So we're talking massive changes, and the point is the government are not only not addressing this, they're not only not meeting their targets to try and bring emissions down, they're actually not preparing us. So in terms of what the government is preparing for, the CCC, the Climate Change Committee's report, said that they are not preparing us at all for a 2-degree world, which they're saying that we absolutely must be prepared for. That's what's coming in 2050 if we don't make radical changes right now. And in fact, the CCC report is actually saying to the government they need to be preparing us for a 4-degree world, which, is essentially an admission that that is where we're going. I mean, they don't need to admit it. That's what the science shows. That's where we're heading by the end of the century. So the government are not meeting their targets. They're not preparing us for the world that we're going to be living in. And even worse than that, they're actually bankrolling and subsidizing more fossil fuel emissions. They're bankrolling new fossil fuel projects. They're subsidizing fossil fuel industries overseas, which don't get counted in our carbon budget accountability. So basically it doesn't show up on our, and they get to say, oh, you know, emissions are falling. Well, they are falling a little bit here. They're not falling nearly as fast as they need to be, but the government is saying, well, they're falling, so it's fine. They're not falling nearly as fast as they need to be to get us to carbon zero by 2050. But the point is that's only our terrestrial emissions, and they're only falling really in the power sector. They're not falling in surface transport, in aviation, in shipping, in buildings. That's where we need to be seeing the cuts. And the point is that they're also not even in those accountability figures for carbon emissions. That doesn't even include shipping, and it doesn't include international aviation anyway. And most importantly, it doesn't include imported carbon emissions. So it doesn't include emissions from the stuff that we buy. So basically, we're just outsourcing our carbon emissions and blaming other countries. And then the government's saying, oh, well, we're bringing ours down, which isn't true anyway, even if that was going to be helpful. So not only that, but they are bankrolling new projects. They're bankrolling new opening of new collieries, opening of new power stations that run off gas. We need to be stopping all. There's already enough oil and gas and coal in existing fossil fuel projects to blow way over the 2-degree safe limit set by Paris. And we really need to stay below 1.5 degrees, remember. And they're not only continuing with those projects, but actually bankrolling new ones. So it's an absolute hypocrisy to say that, oh, you know, Parliament called a climate emergency or declared a climate emergency last year, but then it's utter hypocrisy because they're doing nothing about it. You know, maybe a few tiny little bits of lip service, but nothing that's going to actually cause any impact. And the Committee on Climate Change are also saying that these next few months are absolutely crucial because this is a time when we need to be coming out of the pandemic in terms of the economy. We need to be starting to lift the economy, but we're being told to buy, spend. We're being told to go and, you know, spend all of our money to put it back into the economy. But that's absolutely not what should be happening, because all that's going to lead to is more fossil fuel emissions. And actually the report is saying that what happens in the next few months is going to determine what happens for the next kind of few decades, because actually now is the time that in order to boost the economy, we have this perfect opportunity to be doing that by pouring money into industries that are going to be greener, that are going to be helping the transition to a carbon-free world, the transition to carbon zero. And that's not what's being promised. That's not that we're seeing. We're being told that the banks are going to be bailing out trillions of pounds to bail out the economy, but not in green industries, basically in dirty money, funding more fossil fuel industries, funding more consumption.
This is something I was going to ask you, actually. Yeah. I mean, you've answered pretty much all my questions amazingly. You've obviously got a really thorough understanding about the report, so thank you for going through all that. But haven't emissions fallen because of the health crisis that we've recently experienced and are still experiencing around the world? Absolutely. And is that not going to help us out?
It's going to help us out, but the thing is they haven't fallen enough even to be within the carbon budget of what it's supposed to have fallen by this year in order to get us out of the crisis. So yes, they've fallen a bit. Brilliant. We need to be capitalizing on that. We need to be pushing and going further, not through lockdown, not through people going through the misery and the suffering that they have in the last 3 months through the pandemic. You know, no one's saying that's what needs to happen, but we need, you know, this has shown us, COVID-19 has shown us what the world can do when they put their mind to it. You know, in February, everyone was saying this is going to be devastating. We're going to have tens of thousands of people dying, and everybody works together and everyone says, right, we're going to take action. Well, the climate and ecological crisis is an emergency, and we're talking millions, if not billions of people dying over the next few decades, and certainly towards the end of the century, unless we take action right now. But yet, when it comes to, you know, can we take action now to prevent that? We need that same sort of concerted, coming together action of people saying, okay, we're going to take sacrifices, nothing like the lockdown, but we need changes across the board in all the industries that rely on fossil fuels. So we need to phase them out. We need to move towards a green economy. We need to do that right now. And COVID has shown us that we can do that. And it's shown us just in a few months that we can bring emissions down. But it would be absolutely a travesty if we didn't use this opportunity to actually keep them going down. But what it's looking like, and what the government is certainly seeming like they're moving towards, is actually to push them back up. And that's absolutely what we mustn't do right now.
Thank you so much. I've got one last question for you. As you can hear behind me, they're sounding the alarm outside Downing Street now, our final stop, because of the report. But as a representative of XR scientists, and XR professionals, do you think that the CCC, the report that the Committee of Climate Change released today, has gone far enough to tackle the climate change issues and the inaction that we're clearly seeing from the government?
Well, that's a really good question. Of course, the CCC are crucial in terms of sounding the alarm that the government's own advisors telling them that they're pitiful and that they're not meeting their targets. That's crucial. However, it's a good question because actually the CCC hasn't gone far enough to damn them, to hold them to account, because actually they're still talking, the CCC are still saying that the government need to get to net zero by 2050, and that's far too late. The UK government needs to commit to net zero even sooner than 2050, and they're not even getting there by 2050, but they have to commit to getting there sooner for several reasons. First of all, getting there by 2050 only gives us, according to the IPCC, the absolute gold standard scientific body about this, that only gives us a 50-50 chance of staying below 1.5 degrees. That is not a gamble that we should be taking. So let me repeat, getting to carbon zero by 2050, which is what we're trying to get to, or well, that's what they say they're trying to get to, but they're not. Even that will only give us a 50-50 chance of staying below 1.5 degrees. That is not enough. We cannot risk human civilization on that. And secondly, actually, that figure has recently been revised. There's been new research out recently that says actually, for even just a 2 in 3 chance of staying below even higher 2 degrees warming, which we must stay below, we actually only have half what's currently budgeted in the budgets to bring us down to carbon zero by 2050. So actually we need to be halving even what we thought we could emit, which would bring us down to 2050 to carbon zero by 2050. So actually we're not in line. It's a total joke that they're still saying 2050 is fast enough. We need to be getting down much, much quicker. Plus, the UK has a historical responsibility because of our emissions is what started this in the first place through the Industrial Revolution. So we need to get down quicker. We also have a far greater proportion of carbon emissions per head, per capita, than many other countries. We're about twice as much as the global average per head. So we have a responsibility to reduce our emissions faster than other countries. Also, as a wealthier nation on the whole, I know there's a lot of people who aren't wealthy in this country, and there's a terrible disparity in this country with wealth. But as on the whole, as a wealthier nation, we need to be cutting our emissions far faster than other countries, or we're going to leave other countries with simply nothing, no carbon left to burn, whilst we're sort of pootling on down. We need to be cutting our emissions by at least 8% every single year from now on and get down to half by 2030. And that is absolutely nothing close to what's happening. And that's, like I said, even to get us to 2050, we actually need to be getting to carbon zero, net zero by way sooner than 2050. And so the Committee on Climate Change, first of all, they're not calling for us to move the target, which absolutely is what scientists across the world universally agree needs to be done. Secondly, they have sort of almost congratulated the government on the fact that their carbon accounting is going to start to include aviation and shipping, which is essential. Otherwise, we're just burying our head in the sand and pretending that doesn't exist and saying, oh, look, well done us. We've gone down a tiny bit, which is insignificant. But they're only saying it needs to include aviation and shipping from 13 years from now. So really, the accounting budget needs to include aviation and shipping from now, and the Committee on Climate Change hasn't been strong enough on that. And finally, final point is that they've acknowledged that the government has appointed a Citizens' Assembly, and the Committee on Climate Change has said, great, this shows that the government's making an effort to consult with and inform the public. And we at Extinction Rebellion say, well, absolutely, that's not enough. A Citizens' Assembly, it shouldn't just be a sort of lip service to say we're talking to the public. That Citizens' Assembly needs to have legislative power. It needs to have the power to make changes. And that's one of Extinction Rebellion's demands. So we need to get to carbon zero faster. We need to tell the truth about what's actually happening, and the government is not telling the truth. We need to get to carbon zero much faster than 2050, by 2025, 2030 at the absolute latest. We need to get a Citizens' Assembly who can actually take action. And the Committee on Climate Change are not being strong enough on those particular parts of the demands.
Emily, thank you so much. You've obviously got a real thorough understanding of the climate report that just only came out today. And thank you for joining us and sharing your thoughts and actually being able to set out very clearly what needs to happen. And it sounds like a hell of a lot. So Dr. Emily Grossman, thank you so much for joining us today. And hopefully we'll speak soon.
Thanks.